I'm here in the Deancastle Country Park in Kilmarnock to explain a little bit about the parabolic loop and why I found it quite helpful both in thinking about my own practice and identity as a minister and in supervising others. This is our local country park. Quite often I come here with my wife and we wander around. In fact, over the years we've developed a route. While there are lots of different paths in the park, we found that there's one in particular that we enjoy. Takes about 40 minutes and conveniently it finishes at the coffee shop just at the other side of the park. That sense of having a pattern, a routine if you like, a place where we always walk is kind of one of the pictures I found helpful in the parabolic loop. It provides a route, a fairly simple route, a map if you like, through the process of reflecting theologically both on our practice of ministry and our identity as ministers. And because there is that path and that route, there develops some kind of comfort or familiarity, but I hope one that doesn't breed some kind of content or superficial dealing with issues of theological reflection. When we come here to the park, for all that we walk round the same path each time, the park's different. The seasons change, the staff move the animals into different parts of the park and they carry out developments. So we walk along the same path and we're on the lookout for new things. I think the parabolic loop offers that kind of fixed path-like approach to thinking about ministry, but also because we're doing the same thing each time we use the parabolic loop, encourages us to look and see what's new or different or deeper about our practice or our developing understanding of who we are as ministers. Quite recently, the people in the park built this new walkway. Before, people who visited the park couldn't come down here because it was just too marshy, and that meant that you couldn't see the flowers and the wildlife down in this boggy part of the countryside. But we come down here now because they support a route through this area so that we can see different parts of the park. In the same kind of way, I think the parabolic loop gives us support, particularly to go through areas in theological reflection where we might otherwise become quite bogged down, or more importantly, might feel were too difficult and so we would skirt round them. That's why there is the whole left side of the loop, as you see it on the sheet which I think you might have been handed out, which encourages deep thinking about theological issues connected with our practice of ministry and our identity as ministers. In order to support or to help this reflection, within the parabolic loop there's what's called the Wesleyan quadrilateral. That is four fairly straightforward things, areas if you like, which we can use to help us in theological reflection. We bring our own stories, of course, to the work of theological reflection. It is grounded on our own practice and our experiences, but it doesn't simply stop with them. I've been tempted in the past when I've thought about my work simply to skirt round the difficult issues of thinking theologically about what I am doing or the responses which I sense to experiences which I've had. And so this Wesleyan quadrilateral, asking important questions such as, what does Scripture say to the experiences which I have and reflect on, or what are some of the traditions within my own church life? How do they react and engage with some of the things which I am thinking about? What about reason and common sense, and what about my past? What about experiences which I have had before? How do they influence my thinking about situations now? Some of this is difficult. It can be potentially risky, and so we can feel that because it might be messy, just as before I wouldn't have walked here because of the mess, we might feel in theological reflection that there are things we don't want to think about. The parabolic loop takes us to these messier places and gives us some kind of firmer foundation in order that we might be able to make progress through them. So I would encourage you, when you use the parabolic loop for yourself or with others in conversation, that you do make the effort, difficult though it is, to think deeply and to analyse how you respond, how you think and feel and reflect spiritually on important issues connected with ministry and with who you understand you are, and how that develops as your identity of ministry continues to grow. There is always a chance in theological reflection that you see scary beasties, things that are not always entirely familiar, or things that you are sure about. I'm standing here and my friend is just over there, and between us, I'm pleased to tell you, there's a fence. It's not all that robust, but I'm sure that for the next little while it will do the job. The parabolic loop offers a kind of framework, if you like, a fence. To some extent we might see that as being inconvenient and negative because it forces us to go all the way round the loop. I can't, for example, take a shortcut here back to the coffee shop without going through the field in which my friend is standing. I think I'll just stay on the path, even though that's a longer walk. But likewise, the parabolic loop's structure allows us some kind of safety. And I think, certainly as I have used it more, I have found that that structure has been something I've valued and found to be helpful, particularly when I have engaged in that kind of reflection with other people. I found the structure of that very useful. It's a safe place, I hope, a safe way of thinking about important and sometimes scary things to do with who we are as ministers involved in important and sometimes daunting work in ministry, and also as we think and reflect and improve our practice, which has kind of implicit the sense that, at least to start with, and in truth probably all the way through, we are not as good as we could be. Now, just in case you think this is all a walk in the park, I want to say to you that this last bit is really steep. I'm out of breath having clambered up. The ground is loose under my feet and there's nothing to hold onto. I found that one of the difficulties when I was trying to reflect on my own, on what I was doing as a minister and how that identity was developing. There just sometimes wasn't enough grip. The parabolic loop has helped me, I think, to find some of that grip or purchase, if you like. So there are handholds, there are things that I can grab onto, not least because there are simple, quite open and wide-ranging questions which, going round the loop, forces me to ask myself, to think about and to answer. Those answers aren't being marked by someone, but they are very helpful for me as I develop my own ministerial identity and as I think and reflect on how I might be a better and more faithful and more effective minister. You don't need me to tell you that sometimes ministry is an uphill struggle in all sorts of different ways. It's at those times that having some kind of support, some help in order to allow us to make progress can be a huge advantage. That I have found to be one of the benefits of the parabolic loop. I'd want to say as well that what I really need here is not so much a handhold as a friend to take my hand and to give me a pull to get me up the next part of the hill. I have found that the parabolic loop has been most effective when it has been done either between two people or within a small group, where someone asks insightful questions, who listens attentively, and as a result of that listening probes a little more deeply, tries to find out a little more. That really helps the person who is doing the reflecting, who is answering the questions and thinking about what they hear, to think more deeply and not only in greater depth but sometimes in greater detail about important issues connected with their ministry and their practice. So I need someone here to give me a hand up. I think that the parabolic loop is a useful tool and a roadmap and a help in these kinds of ways, but it's also a team game, and it can be used by people ministering to each other together to help us to make progress in ministry. I wanted to take just a moment or two to think in a little more detail about the different parts of the parabolic loop. It starts off with a welcome and an establishing relationships, where the loop is being used in a group of people or among two people. I'll pick on that just a little bit later on, because I do think that relationships are important in our learning. Thereafter, there's a telling of the story. This kind of theological reflection is always based on real life experiences which we have had. Sometimes experiences which are significant, or sometimes ones which become significant as we think about them a bit more. But they are all about experiences which we have and we recount. So telling the tales of our ministry is an important thing to be doing in this kind of theological reflection. It may also be that some kind of verbatim report of an encounter or a meeting or an interview might also be useful, but it is based on real life and real practice. After that, there's a bit for blue sky thinking. That's not my style of things, and so I found this quite challenging, but also quite freeing and liberating. There's a chance just to think about possibilities and connections, a bit like brainstorming, I suppose, but the idea I think here is, well, what does that story have to say about this or that or the other? And you can choose what this, that and the other are. It's very much about intuition and feeling and sensing, and not being constrained but being encouraged to be more free. And that sets the scene for what I think is the harder part of the theological reflection, which is thinking about issues of theology or justice, reflecting quite deeply, thinking about what is true and meaningful and significant, where God might be in this encounter. As I've said before, the Wesleyan quadrilateral offers 4 ways into doing that. These are helpful when they're helpful. I think they can be ignored when they're not. I have found them useful ways in to this quite deep thinking. And then there is the encouragement within the parabolic loop to think about emotions which were raised as a result of the experience and this deep thinking. The idea is that we are real people. We are living, breathing, feeling people. And as ministers, how we feel about things, how we think in the depths of ourselves about who we are as ministers and what we are doing in ministry, these are all important. They're important to God, they're important to us as well for our ongoing development. It's very easy, I have found, to skirt round these sorts of things. The parabolic loop doesn't give me so much of a chance to do that. And so, when people ask questions, the use of the loop means that they are entitled to ask questions about the emotions which were stirred, about the relationships which are influenced and affected, not only those which took place in the encounter, but perhaps other ones which are brought to mind as a result of reflecting on a particular experience. Issues of compassion and humanity. Where is God in my whole experience as a whole person? Still someone who makes mistakes, who wanders and strays, who sins in a world which is full of what is suboptimal and misses the mark. But where do I sense God's presence and God's leading? And how does God want me to continue, step by step, to develop as a minister and to develop and improve my practice of ministry? These are the sorts of issues which I think are being dealt with in some depth and in some detail in this left-hand side of the parabolic loop. But it doesn't just end with ruminating on the past. It's also to do with how I move forward. So we come back out of the loop and we think about where we're going and what we're going to do and how our practice might develop as a result of this reflection. And that's a quick run round the parabolic loop. This is the last stopping off point on our trip round the park. I'm not sure that it's the most important, but it is my favourite. It's the coffee shop in the visitor centre up the hill. I really enjoy going in there for a coffee and a blether and a bit of warmth after what is sometimes quite a strenuous wander around the park, especially for someone as out of condition as I am. I think it's important though that we recognise within the parabolic loop that friendship and fellowship and support and being together is a really important part. I'm not sure that it's a tool that we're meant to use on our own. And I recall in the Gospels the disciples are said to return to Jesus and tell him about all the things that they've done. I imagine they are full of excitement, and I have this notion in the back of my head that Jesus does the equivalent of put the kettle on. He's excited, he's interested to hear what they have to say, and he is also asking insightful questions about where they might go next, about how they might develop, about how they might become more faithful and more effective disciples. The parabolic loop isn't the answer to all the issues we face in ministry, but I do think that it is some help, and I hope that this quick run through the loop and some of the things which I found good about it encourage you at least to have a look at it, perhaps to give it a go, and to see how the process of thinking in some depth theologically about what we are doing as ministers and about our developing ministerial identity might help you to continue to grow in your service and in your own ministries. And so, from a very pleasant Kilmarnock countryside, it's back to Coatbridge.